So growing up in one's family, I think you often take a whole lot of things for granted. And there was, in my case, very little understanding about why my father and grandfather seemed to be really busy and how they arrived at these stances and beliefs. I just knew that they traveled a lot. But now it is so fascinating and rewarding to realize what an exceptional person E. Stanley Jones was. And you know why he was exceptional? It was just because of Jesus. In his day, he was known all over the world, but it was really India that gave him the ultimate challenge. And my father would often say, India was the anvil on which he tempered and solidified his faith. But let me tell you a bit about his early years and how he arrived at what was to be his life's work, an evangelist for Jesus Christ. Brother Stanley, and he loved being called Brother Stanley. He didn't mind Dr. Jones, but he really liked Brother Stanley. He was born in 1884 in Clarksville, Maryland, a rural community not far from Baltimore. He was one of 4 children, and by his own acknowledgement, he would say, my background was ordinary, I was ordinary in appearance, in education, in gifts, everything was quite ordinary. His autobiography tells us that as a teenager, he ran with a gang. Now, I don't think his gang would be the kind of gang that you and I would worry about in these days. However, and despite his outer rebelliousness, this young man, this gang member, was receptive when a visiting evangelist came to his church and spoke on what Christ meant to him. Now, that night, the young rebel, my grandfather, along with his friends, they had planned to disrupt the service. The disruption did not happen, and to the astonishment and to the annoyance of my grandfather's friends, he responded to the evangelist's call, and something extraordinary happened to him that evening. He had a dramatic conversion that changed his life. Now, Jones would speak about 2 conversions. The first was what he called, that was that night, his horizontal change. It was on the outside only. And the authentic one, the vertical one, came 2 years later, and it was then that he was radically and enduringly changed on the inside as well. Conversion, then, in the form of surrender to Jesus, would become a main theme of his life and ministry. He had planned to be a lawyer, but instead entered the ministry. And once he assumed the responsibilities of faithful discipleship, he never turned back. He plowed a straight furrow to Asbury College, to evangelism, to missionary service in India, and to world-renowned as a witness for Jesus Christ. He went to India in 1907 as a missionary. He was just 23 years old, and you might be astonished to learn how casually the mission boards treated their new missionaries in those days. There was no orientation given, either for the country, its customs, or climate, or even how to get around. He knew he didn't want to eat rice, so he elected not to go to China. Little did he know about India's basmati rice. He was given a one-way ship passage from New York City to Bombay, and the voyage took 6 weeks. While he was given the name of his ultimate destination, Lucknow, getting there was up to him. So he tells the story of this 20-hour train ride to his final destination. He found himself in a compartment with a well-educated, English-speaking Muslim gentleman. Full of enthusiasm for his missionary work, he read the gentleman the Sermon on the Mount, expecting him to be immediately converted. Instead, the man said, "We have the same thing in our sacred book." So this was the first time that my grandfather had come up against the very familiar, all religions are the same, only the paths are different attitude, so widely held by many in the non-Christian world. It shook him because he was not prepared to deal with such attitudes. But it also made him face squarely at a very early point in his missionary career the question of whether he was going to argue or debate with non-Christians and try to prove them wrong and Christianity right, or use some other way. He was led to consider another way, and I think this was a crucial decision which contributed to his great effectiveness. He also felt an uneasiness and alarm with what was happening in the Christian convert community. Too often, in changing their faith, the new converts were also encouraged to take with their new faith a new foreign culture and essentially reject their identification with Indian culture. But remember, at the same time, this was British India, and there was a rising tide for independence and nationalism. So some Indian Christians were, in fact, becoming aliens in their own country. Urging Indian Christians to remain Indian was, I feel, one of my grandfather's important contributions to Christian missions. After he married my grandmother, Mathews-Younes, in 1911, they went to Sitapur. She was an educational missionary, and it was in Sitapur that the Joneses became district missionaries in charge of education, evangelism, finance, disaster relief, minor medical service, and editorship thrown in. Their plates were very full. I want to say a word about my grandmother, I can't get that one straight, who was a gifted educator and served as a missionary as well. There was a very, very interesting correspondence that she had for years with Mahatma Gandhi around the education of young boys. There's a book out about my grandmother called A Love Affair with India, done by Bishop Chamberlain's wife, Martha Chamberlain, and it's a very sweet story of this remarkable woman. But it was in Sitapur, and Matt and Tom and I, we went to Sitapur, and it's no longer a little dusty town. It's a big town now, a big city now. It was in Sitapur when Brother Stanley came into real contact with educated non-Christians. A casual remark by a Hindu judge made him ponder his whole approach to the non-Christian world. This judge once asked, why was E. Stanley Jones only interested in the outcasts of India and not the high caste or the educated classes? My grandfather responded that he thought nobody else would be interested, and the judge said, this is a mistake. We do want you if you come in the right way. This comment, provided you come in the right way, really changed my grandfather's focus. He wrote, and I quote, I began to see where my life work lay. Since he was being called to be an evangelist, he had to decide what was essential and what was non-essential in the system that had grown up around Jesus. He added, and I quote, I had to struggle with my own mental attitudes. I had been brought up a theological conservative with a neat, tied up with a ribbon theological system, and so my mind was not free to follow the truth wherever it led me. He wrote, and I quote, when I first went to India, I was trying to hold a very long line, a line that stretched from Genesis to Revelation to Western civilization to the Western Christian Church and even the Hebrew Bible. I found myself bobbing up and down that line, fighting behind Moses and David and Jesus and Paul and Western civilization. There was no well-defined issue. I continue. I had the ill-defined but instinctive feeling that the heart of the matter was being left out. Then I saw that I could and I should shorten my line, that I could take my stand at Christ, and before that non-Christian world refused to know anything save Jesus Christ. I saw that the gospel lies in the person of Jesus, that he himself is the good news, and that my one task was to live and to present him. My task was simplified. Thus began Brother Stanley's great adventure throughout India. He was speaking constantly then to ever-growing groups of educated non-Christians. He was presenting Christ as a disentangled Christ, apart from Western civilization. Christ was presented as a universal Christ belonging to all cultures, all races, and the answer to all human need. His audience was interested in this Christ. His first book, Christ of the Indian Road, published in 1925, made this point clear, and I appreciate both Matt and Tom pitching that book. You read the first two chapters, and you just kind of got what E. Stanley Jones was trying to do. He had a unique and threefold approach to presenting Jesus. First, he held his lectures. They were never called sermons, in public halls, which would obviously be a neutral place for non-Christians. They didn't necessarily want to go into the church. Prominent non-Christians were always invited to kind of chair the lecture. After the lecture, the next 2 hours were reserved for questions from the audience. There were generally 50 to 200 lawyers in each meeting, and the questions were always penetrating. I remember that when I traveled with him, I went to these meetings, and there were tons and tons of people in these very crowded halls. People were hanging at the windows to listen to him. And when he finished speaking, the questions would come. And like my mother before me, because she'd also traveled with her father, I was appalled at the questions. And I was really certain that he could not answer them because they were really, really hard questions. So I remember slipping lower and lower in my seat, waiting for the humiliation. But to my real surprise and, of course, personal relief, not only did he answer them, but he answered them well, never in a provocative or testy or argumentative way. So I took a deep breath and realized he was well able to take care of himself, and he did not need me worrying about him. A more intimate approach to presenting Jesus to the non-Christian world was his roundtable conferences. Jones felt strongly that he had no right to teach others if he was not willing to learn from them. He said, and I quote, "I came to India with everything to teach and nothing to learn. I now learn as well, and I'm a better man for having come into contact with the gentle heart of the East." Leading representatives of different faiths, including agnostics and atheists, maybe 30 to 40 people, were invited to share what their faith or lack of faith meant to them in experience. Jones would ask, "Tell us what you have found through your faith. What does it do for you in your everyday life?" And I quote from Jones here. "In looking back at the roundtable approach, I see now how daring and decisive this approach was. Here we were putting our cards on the table and asking the non-Christian world to do the same. Suppose our hands with which we were playing the game of life should turn out to be inadequate, and suppose other ways of life should prove more adequate. This was a showdown, and the stakes were high. In every situation, the trump card was Jesus Christ. He made the difference. The people who followed him might be spotty and inadequate, but they had hold of the spotless and adequate, or better still, Christ had hold of them." Present-day dialogues with non-Christian faiths have been heralded as something new, and they're certainly very important. E. Stanley Jones was holding these conversations more than 80 years ago. So now to the development of the Christian ashram. Out of his experience of constantly speaking in public and roundtable conferences, he knew that he needed a spiritual base, a base for spiritual reflection and refreshment where there could be in-depth study within the company of a close-knit group where he could live with accountability. He really wanted to be accountable to others. And a part of his motivation for this accountability to fellowship he describes as follows, and I quote, "I knew that I was to be a missionary and an evangelist, but saw that many evangelists, after a few years of fruitfulness, end up quoting themselves and using phrases from sermons that may have been effective but now are merely slick, like a coin from constant usage. The danger is that lacking a close-knit fellowship to discipline them, they, the evangelists, become dogmatic, cocksure, and wordy. They're telling others what to do, and nobody's telling them what to do." He continues, "Without the ashram, I would have lacked a disciplined fellowship. I would have been a lone wolf, howling at the pack about what they should do. I would have been an outsider. Now I'm an insider. I'm forced to live out my life in a close-knit fellowship of the Spirit. If I have given them anything," that's you all, "they have given me much more. They have helped make me. But the ashram group has not only helped make me, it has helped make my message." Most of his messages and books had to run the gauntlet of a small, disciplined group. If the response from the ashram group was faint or unsatisfactory, or not just what it should be, the message was quietly laid aside. Only that which seemed to have the blessing of the Spirit upon it and apparently was productive in changing lives was kept. I remember hearing him talk at the Satal Christian Ashram, and he was reading an excerpt from his book, and somebody said, "Oh, Brother Stanley, that's not redemptive enough." And so he would set it aside. He believed that this ashram group experience should be in a familiar Indian context, and such a model was clearly available in Hinduism. For he felt strongly, as I said earlier, that the Christian faith as a universal faith benefits from using indigenous forms. So he used the term ashram to express the group fellowship. As you know, ashram is a Sanskrit word that means a place of withdrawal from the everyday work life. It also means it can also mean a place of intense prayer, so it can mean both sides. Jones baptized the word ashram and took it over for Christian purposes with Jesus Christ as the guru. Jones knew that many group movements had arisen in modern times as a result of the desire to put back into the Christian faith the koinonia, the fellowship mentioned in Acts, which was born out of the coming of the Holy Spirit. Jones affirmed the Christian ashram as one such effort, but he did not want it to be one that would usurp or contribute to any dissension or concern on the part of the church, as it would place Christ and not the ashram as primary. He said, and I quote, "It is not the intent of the ashram to take people away from their churches and absorb their loyalty and love apart from the churches. We are trying to make the Christian ashram a movement that inspires new life into persons who become refreshed, renewed, and therefore better pastors and better church members. So the Christian ashram movement, as you know, took hold in India, and when Jones was stranded in the United States in 1940 during World War II, he transplanted it here, and you are the recipients of that transplantation as well, I'm quite sure. Jones was often asked this question about the ashram. What does it take to become a member of the ashram group? His answer was, and I quote, "We have one qualification and only one. Do you want to be different? If you want to be different, come on. But if you don't want to be different, we can do nothing for you." The crux of being made different is in self-surrender. Only when the self is surrendered can you cultivate your spiritual life around a new center, Christ, and Christ in control. And then everything falls into place. Jones was intentionally strategic about the design of the Christian ashram. And as you know, the first meeting is it's called the morning, or the time of the open heart. And the critical question that is asked in that experience is, what do you really need? And essentially, the expressed needs, whatever you say or what I say, that then becomes the raw material for the teaching content of the ashram evangelists and Bible teachers. The answers to whatever needs we have expressed are then offered in the subsequent ashram addresses. So according to Jones, the preaching at an ashram is not just preaching, but it's prescription. He says, and I quote, "The patients," that's us, "had described their symptoms in the open heart, and now I had to give in my addresses the prescription for the cure. I could present Jesus as the remedy in every situation, but only so far as I had experienced or attested it. It must be testimony, as all great literature is autobiographical, so all great preaching must be testimony." I've been thinking a lot about the ashram movement lately, and in part because of that wonderful opportunity to do that little ashram history, and been thinking about what we need to do to continue to grow. Sometimes people say, oh, you're out of touch, or the ashram was more effective in a previous generation, or Stanley Jones isn't here anymore, and whatever. And then it dawned on me that as we really listen to the sharing in the open heart and learn about the needs of whomever is attending the ashram, we're going to hear their current needs. We're not going to hear the needs that E. Stanley Jones heard and wrote about. And as we really listen, there's no way we can be out of touch, not at all. We're going to hear stories, and we do hear stories of brokenness and the anticipation and hope for healing and transformation. The ashram has no reason to look back or focus on yesterday or risk being outdated, for all ashram participants are in the presence of the now, the present human need, and the Holy Spirit in its full contemporaneousness. As you know, at the end of the ashram is the overflowing heart, and that's held when participants discover that the ashram fellowship, the experience of living in the kingdom of God in miniature, has become redemptive. E. Stanley Jones writes about this, the overflowing heart. He says, "We try to put our finger on the central problem of life, the problem of self-centeredness. To do so, we insist on self-surrender. A woman said to me once, 'I found you out. You have only one remedy, self-surrender.' I laughed and said, 'I'm glad you found me out, for I had found myself out. I cannot go down any road with anybody on any problem without running into the necessity of self-surrender." Long-term Christian ashram leader, Brother Gordon Hunter, an earlier member of the Four, affirmed that the time of the overflowing heart was the most exciting time of the ashram. And Marjorie, his daughter, is here tonight. I'm going to read you what your dad wrote about this exciting moment of the overflowing heart. So I quote from Gordon Hunter. "What are these people saying? How come they're filled with new visions? Well, it happens. Over and over again, it happens. Nor is it just a momentary feeling of goodwill. In life after life, something so vital has happened that while the emotional overtones may disappear, the essence of the experience will remain forever and continue to bear fruit." Brother Stanley once described the ashram like a ship coming into lift locks. It is enclosed temporarily in a specialized situation. Into that situation is poured tons and tons of water, which lifts the whole ship and all of its cargo and passengers and sends it out on a permanent higher level. It's something like that happens to us at an ashram. Jones was adamant that leaders follow the ashram model with fidelity. Now, obviously, there's cultural competence, and he designed this a while ago, but the infrastructure of the ashram, he thought, was designed in such a way to get the results that we all seek. I want to say another word about the significance of self-surrender to Brother Stanley, and I appreciate both Brother Matt and Brother Bishop making some very helpful comments, and Tom as well, about how my grandfather's final surrender, although he would often say you can often have to surrender on a daily basis, really resulted in his healing at that Lucknow church. Jones asserted that the Christian faith demands of us at its deepest demand surrender. And let me illustrate the power with this picture. This is a statue in Denmark. And Jones recalls the experience of viewing this magnificent statue, and I quote, "As I walked up the cathedral aisle to see the wonderful statue, I was almost overcome with awe. But as I walked along, my Danish friend whispered, 'You will not be able to see his face unless you kneel at his feet.' It was true, for Christ was standing with outstretched arms but looking down. I knelt at his feet, and only then was his face looking into mine. You can't really see Christ until you surrender to him. Those who start afar off, surveying him, never really see his face. So bend the knee, be conquered by him, surrender yourself." I love this statue. It's often seen in medical settings, and it's at the Johns Hopkins Hospital in Baltimore. And my sister and I used to go and look at it when she was there for her treatments. And it is really, it's a massive statue. And I didn't believe what my grandfather had said. So I looked at it, and in fact, Jesus was not looking at me. So I moved up real close, right to the base, and as I knelt, he was only looking at me. The eyes bore right into you. It was a statue of great solace to both of us. My grandfather was always an evangelist, and my father would often say that E. Stanley Jones was the ablest interpreter of the gospel for the present day of anybody he had heard. For Jones, there was no contradiction between the Old Testament prophet and the New Testament evangelist. The two belong together as response to the gospel and obedience to the gospel. As you surely know, that the vocation of evangelist periodically falls into disrepute at the hands of some of its practitioners, and then God raises up those who bring evangelists into good repute again. For his generation, Jones was one of those persons, and I know that the Christian Ashram has evangelists who've been raised up as well to preach to our current day, and we've been profoundly blessed to hear such evangelists during this Christian Ashram. Maybe in the early days, folks would have thought that Jones would have identified himself as a soul winner, S-O-U-L. But over the years, he broadened his perspective. He became interested in body, mind, and spirit, the whole person. He saw the gospel of Jesus Christ enabling fractured and partial persons to become whole persons. I think that his most original book was The Way, and in that book he enlarges on the idea that the Christian way is written into the texture of life. And I'm so pleased that it's been so beautifully reprinted by Abington Press, and it's available as well. I thought you might be interested in learning a bit about the relationship between E. Stanley Jones and Gandhi. This slide is one where Gandhi is writing Jones to ask him to speak out to the British on behalf of Indian independence. And then one of these other slides is very interesting, as it's Gandhi's response to Jones's evangelistic efforts towards Gandhi. Gandhi writes, he says that my heart is open, but it's a matter of the heart. And then there's the wonderful story about the triangle relationship among E. Stanley Jones, Gandhi, and Martin Luther King. So here's the story. My mother tells me of an occasion in Boston when Dr. Martin Luther King was being honored by Boston University at a convocation prior to going to Sweden to receive the 1964 Nobel Peace Prize. At the reception, my mother was introduced to Dr. King, and my grandfather was mentioned. Dr. King immediately stopped and became very serious and said, "Your father was a very important person to me, for it was his book on Mahatma Gandhi that triggered my use of Gandhi's method of nonviolence as a weapon for our people's freedom in the United States." King continued saying, although he'd been very familiar with the writings on Gandhi and had been interested in his method of nonviolence for some years, it is still not clicked for him that it was a vehicle for use in the United States. Reading my grandfather's book on Gandhi may have assisted King with the application of Gandhian principles within a Christian context. And here's a picture of my grandfather's book on Gandhi, as seen in the Martin Luther King Library. The book contains a handwritten note by King that reads, "This is it. This is the way to achieve freedom for the Negro in America." Everywhere Brother Stanley went, he tried to be a reconciling spirit between differences. Among individuals, groups, and communities in India and around the world, my grandfather made some serious efforts toward averting the war between the United States and Japan in 1941. But that's another story. However, I do want to mention that between tomorrow, this period between August 6th and August 9th, is the 70th anniversary of the nuclear bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Needless to say, Jones was very opposed to war. But that's a book. He was a highly disciplined person. When in college, he developed the practice of 2 hours of prayer and meditation a day. Morning and evening, he would slip away for his hour of devotion, which he later called his listening post. Because of this devotional schedule and his adherence to it, he was the despair of hostesses who wanted guests to enjoy his marvelous conversation. But he would slip away. Let me tell you a story about one experience he had during a daily devotion. And I quote here from Jones. "I have what I call the listening post in the morning. I found that as I got older, I woke earlier and didn't quite know what to put into the blank space in the morning. So I said, I'll set up a listening post. I won't ask God for anything, but I'll listen. If he's got anything to say to me, he will say it to me. Sometimes he says, Stanley, you better change this and this and this. And I say, all right, wait till the morning and I'll change it. One morning I said to him, God, have you anything to say to me? And God said, no, I love you. Go back to sleep. You can, if you look at the E. Stanley Jones Facebook page, you can see this video. It's very cute. But this is important. But a year ago, this is again Jones speaking, he said something to me which I'll never forget. I said, have you anything to say to me? He said, yes, you are mine, life is yours. Oh, please say that again. God said, you're mine, life is yours. If I belong to him, then life belongs to me. I can go out and master it and conquer it and overcome it and take something out of it. Life belongs to me. Up until the age of 87, Jones kept up a very rigorous and active life. It's estimated that he preached 60,000 sermons, sometimes 5 to 7 times a day. I heard him speak that many times. I was tired. He was not. Just think what he could have done with the internet. So in 1971, after a strenuous 2 months in Japan, speaking 154 times, he had a stroke. And after some months in rehabilitation hospitals in Boston, he asked to return to India. The doctors concurred. He wrote us in 1972 that he felt that the year of the stroke, was for him the practical application of all that he had been preaching. It was the year of using his infirmities. By faith and determination, he managed to walk once more, up to a mile, preached publicly again some 50 times, despite major speech difficulties. He would say, if I cannot preach a sermon, I will be a sermon. When life says no, God still says yes. And such was the affirmation he made in his last book, The Divine Yes. 3.5 million copies of his books have been sold. They've been translated into more than 30 languages. All proceeds from his books, more than $1 million, and that was in the 70s, that's still a lot of money, have gone into Christian projects, including the United Christian Ashrams. He gave all of his money away for evangelistic and other Christian purposes. He would often say, I need enough money for my needs, and where my needs end, another person's needs begin, and so that money belongs to them. These are some pictures. You have this picture in the back, but I'll let her move on to 34. I love the covers and I love the autograph. So you have this picture in the back there and with the story. And again, the artist has not imposed Christ on the words, but has inked the words light or dark to bring out the figure of Christ. Out of the words arises the flesh of Christ. So if you are young or have strong readers, you can go back and read the lines. It's 185,000 words. It's all the New Testament. He was a wonderful grandfather. He was lots of fun. As I was growing up, he spent every Christmas with us, and his arrival was a time of great anticipation because he played with us. He loved to swim. He loved to watch baseball. He was an excellent athlete, and he had a terrific sense of humor. I traveled with him as a young adult, just out of college, to India and Africa. And then in 1972, my brother and father and I took him back to India to live after his brainstem stroke. As he approached his 89th birthday, he had made remarkable progress in his battle to learn how to walk again. Nevertheless, the response of a complete health was not in store for my grandfather. He was open, and he would write about this in the Divine Yes. He was open to a complete healing, but he also knew that he remained the same person pre- and post-stroke, and that he could use the suffering he experienced from his stroke to affirm the Divine Yes, Jesus, in his life. He completed the book, The Divine Yes, in late 1972, and his mission seemed to be at an end. The final decline was rapid, and in January 1973, he died. My father wrote, "When last seen, he was walking with God, and God took him." So now, more than 40 years after his death, I find that his books and sermons, many were written in the 30s and 40s, are really now not out of date, and with few exceptions, are entirely relevant to today's world. He's on Facebook, he's on Twitter. You can sign up for both of those. If you want to hear from E. Stanley Jones every day on Twitter, please sign up for that. And I want to say another word about the significance of the Christian Ashram in E. Stanley Jones's ministry. It's now been operating in North America for the past 75 years, and we are thrilled that we are celebrating the 75th anniversary. During the years when Jones was actively engaged in Christian ashrams, he would spend 6 months a year traveling to many of the dozens of week-long Christian ashrams that were offered across the United States and Canada. Since the death of E. Stanley Jones in 73, the Christian ashram under indigenous leadership continues to show how Christ touches us vitally and redemptively at every point of need. This direct, very personal evangelism is the essence of the Christian ashram experience. The continued creative functioning of the Christian ashram movement is testament to committed leadership like you and your 12. Folks remain committed to the ashram experience as a powerful encounter with the risen Christ. Jones's biographer, Stephen Graham, wrote about the Christian ashram as follows. As one reads about and closely examines the spirit, the intent, and the scope of the ashram, one detects the rich blend of Christianity's spiritual and theological emphases down through the ages. Characteristics were so bedrock to and exemplified in Christ's ministry, namely holiness, compassion, contemplation, evangelistic zeal, and charismatic and incarnational, full-dimensional living. The Christian ashram, with its bedrock focus on Jesus, is engaging with this world and is offering full-dimensional living and a life-changing alternative in the midst of the current religious and cultural upheavals. The E. Stanley Jones Foundation, as Tom said, I'm blessed to serve as the president of this organization, and we are really just trying to get his writings out and to encourage seminaries to teach E. Stanley Jones. One of the things that I very much want to be kind of a handoff to the Christian ashram movement, so I can get people to read the words. But if they really want to understand what the words mean, they have to understand the word become flesh, and so they have to attend an ashram. And it was wonderful to meet a woman at the Redwood Christian Ashram who I've been corresponding with for at least a year and a half, sent her all kinds of words. And I said, just please go to an ashram, and she was there. Let me make some closing comments about the legacy of E. Stanley Jones. I believe that he foresaw where some of the great issues would be and spoke to them long before they were recognized, often at great unpopularity and even antagonism and derision to himself. I think that he was something of a prophet, and his honors, and he did receive them, were all laid at the feet of Jesus. He was a pioneer, a man before his time. He spoke out for racial justice, even in the Deep South in America, at a time when it was not popular to do so. Not surprisingly, it used to be said that in the 1930s, that E. Stanley Jones and Eleanor Roosevelt should be hanged from the same tree. He insisted that all of his meetings be integrated, and he would not hold them if that was not the case. He found the Christian movement, scattering its energies around marginal issues of doctrine and denominations, and left it centered on Jesus Christ as the one and central issue. He found the kingdom of God largely inward and mystical or futuristic in heaven, and he put it into life as the one issue now, supplanting all the alternatives of the other isms, communism, fascism, and the like. The kingdom of God on earth now is the issue. He found the ashram movement Indian and localized and left it internationalized and universalized. In conclusion, my grandfather would repeatedly affirm that it does not take much of a man or woman to be a Christian, but it takes all that there is of him or her. He would say it doesn't matter how much you've got, it matters how much God's got of you. God certainly had all of E. Stanley Jones, and that was enough to change the world. Thank you.